And it is another week of the show banned in every capitalist nation around the globe. Disruptive Innovation FM. I'm your host, Jeffrey Colon, at DJGEOFFE on Twitter. Coming to you from the wonderful metropolitan area of New York City, also known as the Big Apple. And got a great show for us tonight to talk about 11 ways to figure out if you're implementing disruptive innovation for your business. And I also want to talk about the Guy Kawasaki incident this past week. Mr. Auto Tweet, we will call him going forward. And finally, we will also talk about the wonderful ongoing debate between Android and Windows 8 and iOS. Which mobile operating system will be the disruptive innovator? So, first off, want to give a big shout out to Boston. Got to speak in Boston not too long ago. I think it was I'm trying to think. Maybe it was the end of last year. I was up there actually talking about disruptive innovation with a panel that also featured Michael Lazaro of Buddy Media, which is now owned by Salesforce. And it was just a wonderful panel. There's so many smart people in Boston. Boston's such a passionate town. And it's unfortunate what happened there this past Monday, the Boston Marathon. And for anyone who's a big running fan, and I'm definitely a big running fan and have done a half marathon and really enjoy sort of the 5K, 10K races. But running really is the most peaceful sport in the world if you think about it, because it's about the individual, yet you're running in large masses, and can be very inspiring. So let's hope that the city gets back up and running stronger than ever. Great startup community there and a wonderful biotech community. And of course, we wouldn't have Facebook if it weren't for the fact that Harvard sort of gave birth to the world's largest social network. But I wanted to talk about this little list that was generated this past week that a professor from the University of Missouri in Kansas City, the Block School of Business, Professor Dean Tenkitan, I hope I'm getting that correct, he laid out a really interesting list of 11 strategic questions to ask yourself about disruptive innovation if you're about to go into business in the startup world, or for that matter, in any type of business proposition. What are the 11 things to ask yourself in terms of how to take advantage of strategy to sort of move your business ahead, be innovative, sustain, and disrupt all at the same time? And I really enjoyed this list. I actually wanted to share it with everyone because I think it's something that everyone should ask these questions. So one is, what feature can you create that's missing in someone else's product? So a lot of times when we talked on this show, we've talked about the differences between pure innovation and disruptive innovation. And I think this question hits at the core. What's out there that other products are not featuring that you can sort of feature that takes away from their glamour? Where can you disrupt significant cost areas in both physical goods or existing digital goods? So I think what we've seen in the past couple of years is many online companies disrupting the physical nature of commerce. Now, fast forward ahead, we're actually seeing mobile disrupt sort of the .com startups that got ahead in the early 2000s, so to speak. We've now gone through sort of like this 10-year interim, and we're seeing digital companies sort of disrupt digital companies. So it's quite interesting to sort of see how that's going to play out. His third point on the list is, how can you digitize a physical element, action, or experience, or digitize all three? So this is also an interesting thing, because now we've actually moved into a world where I would actually say, if you can digitize a physical element, how can you also bring that full circle so that you can take advantage of the physicality in a post-digital world, since so many people are wanting to connect with others again after doing things with them, after sort of having social networking in the digital capacity. What steps can you take to create a service out of your strongest or most prevalent support capability? That's an interesting one to think about, especially since we are moving stronger and stronger into areas such as software as a service, marketing as a service, and generally we're a service economy. And I used to think to myself in the 90s as a service economy, that was people, doing goods and services such as your laundry or dry cleaning, fixing your car, etc. But now we're actually moving into areas where software is providing a service in terms of tabulation on what your return on investment is, payroll, timesheets. There's a large amount of tracking services available that fall into that software as a service element. How can you inject a completely emotional experience into what you do? And a lot of people have been asking me the question of what makes virality. And I think the interesting fact of what many people miss out on is that there is no emotional experience in much of what brands do. So, if you think about what has sort of been happening this past week out there in terms of what's been shared, Dove, which, disclaimer, Ogilvy, which is my employer, they're a client. They did a very interesting, I should say Ogilvy Toronto, did a very interesting campaign that talked about, that had women rate other women's beauty. You probably have seen this. If not, I encourage you to check it out because it's quite interesting from a sociological standpoint. But the reason why this has taken off so much is because there's so much emotion in that particular campaign. And I think there's a lack of a lot of emotion in many technological startups, a lot of new companies. There's not that sort of emotional resonance. There's not that passion infused in which a person can say, hey, this is actually relevant to me. I actually am interested in this business. So from a growth hacker aesthetic, think about how you can inject more emotional experience into what you do. His next listing here is, have you ever thought about ways to digitize a service? Again, going back into, are there things that exist out there that could probably be brought into the online and mobile domains? How is it possible to smooth demand for inefficient, difficult to provide capabilities? That's an interesting thing as well. What inefficiencies exist out there that could probably be made easier? There's a lot of different areas I think this you can take advantage of here. What would it take to turn in-person interactions into remote interactions? So again, we're looking at how we continue to have dialogue with each other. We talk a lot online now. We talk a lot on social networks. We talk a lot at live events, which is also a good thing. But how do we, if you meet a person at a convention now, if you're actually doing business, how do you continue that relationship online? What communities do you use? What applications do you use? Is there a way for companies to take more advantage of that? How can you digitize scarce resources to put them in more places simultaneously? So this is interesting too. If we look at the globe, What do you do in terms of banking? Many countries don't really use banks or have access to banks in a physical realm. I actually think you'll see more of this in the United States. I was talking to a friend today that noted that HSBC only has 200 physical branches in the U.S. The interesting thing is they could probably take advantage of that fact because it's heavy operating costs to run a physical location. Bank of America and Citibank and Chase have over 3,000 locations. That actually could be interesting if HSBC tried to figure out how to provide a disruptive innovation to the fact that those banks have physical locations. We see that with Ally Bank, which has no physical locations, how they're trying to basically disrupt banking as we've known it. The 10th portion, or the 10th bullet point that he noted is, what could you do to help push the biggest player in your desired market to leave the marketplace? And this is fascinating because we talk a lot, especially in tech, about who the dominant players are. And I think in a static business world, which pretty much existed from the early 1900s until recently, if you became a pretty dominant player, you were probably going to be entrenched as that dominant player for years unless you made some major mistakes. Or, as we note many times in this show, which is based on the book The Innovator's Dilemma, or I should say inspired by the book The Innovator's Dilemma, it's you can also fall gracefully because you're doing everything right and you are not really trying to find or solve the new mysteries of your business. So I think we're starting to see certain businesses start almost to disrupt the biggest players in the business. They almost set out to do that. And then others don't really set out to do that, but when they realize that they can do that, they really go after those particular companies. And then the final point is, if the most prominent player in your market did go away, what opportunities would it open up? So think about the fact that you don't just want to disrupt for the sake of disrupting. You don't gain anything from that. You gain from the fact that you've opened up the marketplace and all eyes are on you, which means all pocketbooks and all transactions could flow toward your business, your startup, your entrepreneurial endeavor. So those are interesting questions again to ask. A little bit of advice that we wanted to give here this particular week, which of course leads me to my next bit in this on the show, which is someone who had not provided good advice, and that is the Guy Kawasaki incident during the Boston Marathon bombings. So on Monday, there were several brands, and rightfully so, who should have turned off their automatic tweets. Don't let me get into the fact that I don't even believe in automatic tweets. I think Twitter, and this is my purist standpoint coming out, but I think Twitter works best when you actually tweet live. Now, I know a lot of brands are going to say there's no way we can do that. We have to schedule everything in advance. But if you have a live person who at least is monitoring a situation at all times, it's very easy for them to realize, you know what, going to go into the dashboard, turn this off. And that's what I mean by tweeting live for some of those bigger brands or bigger personalities. But I really believe you should try to tweet live. It's more authentic, sounds more natural. I also think that I don't like companies or personas that ask other people to write tweets for them. That doesn't come from, it's not your tone of voice. I mean, that's like me asking someone to write my term paper for me that I'm going to hand into my professor. Let's be honest, Twitter is a business communications tool. A CEO or a CMO, no matter how busy they are, can at least tweet a few times per day and it can come from their voice. I think it's pure laziness for some of these executives to hand that off to an intern or someone who's lower in the organization to do, especially considering that the beauty of Twitter is that it is fast, quick, and short message, a short message service. So there is really no need to hand that off to anyone to do. But what happened this past week is Guy Kawasaki did not turn off his auto tweets. And of course, someone had said, hey, maybe you should turn your auto tweets off. I mean, he tweets quite a bit during the day. I think he tweets pretty much every 20 minutes. So he really sort of has a nice flow of information coming. And of course, he tweeted back to the person and said, this is nice news to hear from someone who only has 1,500 followers. Now, I have to stop there for a second because I really like people like Guy. I like people like Seth Godin. I like a lot of these people who write very good essays, books, thought leadership pieces on marketing and social and things of that nature. But I have to say, as a person who's been doing social for quite some time myself and really has not gotten much glamour for it, really just does it because I'm very passionate about it and I enjoy it and I feel it's the way that people communicate. I gotta admit that I think Guy Kawasaki has no clue what he's fucking talking about. And pardon me for swearing, but we're allowed to do that on the show since we're not actually on an FM signal. But seriously, to say that a person who has less than 1,500 followers doesn't know what they're doing shows that many of these people really have no idea how social networks work. It should not matter how many followers you have. That's a CMO's viewpoint on how things work. The real way that Twitter works is we're moving away from follower counts and really into what's the objective of why we're using these communication tools in the first place. The whole reason that they've sort of evolved and have become commonplace is because they've disrupted the normal mechanisms that we've known for marketing for a very long period of time. So if you look at it from the perspective of, hey, I have the most followers, you're looking at Twitter pretty much like you would a normal medium, like an FM radio station or a television network or a website that gets 1 million hits per month. And that's not really the way that you should look or analyze these services. So I really had a big sort of, I got to say, I just don't agree with that assessment. First of all, to talk to people that way. I mean, these people are pretty much just offering advice. You should sort of keep your tone to a human voice. I mean, we're in a very sharing, collaborative economy now. And then the second thing is you can always learn from other people. I think this is one of the issues with a lot of people who sort of, grandstand, who think that they sort of know more than anyone else. You can always learn. So my point is, and I haven't met you, Guy, and I respect you, but I got to call you out on that, is you got to respect the people that follow you. They're not there to troll. They're not there to really harm you. They're just basically saying, hey, there's a big incident that's going on. No brand has ever gotten in trouble for shutting its mouth. You're considered sort of a brand per se. Shut your mouth. Turn off the auto tweets. Take a chill. No one wants to hear about, ways to enhance your follower count or, things that you should do to enhance your stature in the business world when something of major, of a major news event has occurred, especially when most people are really not wanting to hear all that extra noise. A lot of people, as we know, during incidents turn to Twitter for real-time news updates. So when they see sort of marketing messages, sort of turns your stomach because you're like, geez, oh whiz, can you just sort of turn that off for the time being till we get through this news phase and then we can return to business as usual. So I think a lot of brands really have to learn how to, again, be transparent, be natural, have a natural tone, and this where this falls into sort of this whole realm of this particular show is that's disruptive. By sort of having that natural tone, being a human, actually not, coming down hard on the people who sort of follow you, and also understanding that these networks aren't based on numbers as on follower numbers like many of the old media standards. That's understanding sort of how these systems are really sort of disruptive to the old marketing measurement. I really look at some of these companies, people, brands, and if you have 1,000 followers or even 100, If your objective is to do business and make transactions or just connect with people, then it doesn't really matter how many followers you have. It's how you use the technology. So thinking of technology for a second, as we pivot into the next part of the show here, I gotta say that the debate about who will win the mobile phone operating system has become just one big joke on every tech blog that I read out there. I have to almost think to myself when I read some of these reviews, whether they're talking about Apple, Microsoft, Google, Samsung, BlackBerry, Motorola. Who's paying some of these people when they're writing these reviews? I mean, seriously, tech bloggers, at least come out and just say you got paid. I mean, that's the ethical thing to do, don't you think so? So it's gotten to a point now where I have to take all of this with a grain of salt because, you know, you see a lot of these people who really are blogging or are writing things about, you know, subjects they really have no understanding of. So if you look at sort of the mobile operating system, of course, the big player is Android. We know that. It's got 70% of the market share. And it's built on open source, which is a wonderful thing. But the big debate, of course, comes into who's going to be the dominant player. And, of course, a lot of people sort of rip on the fact that, hey, you know, why isn't iOS going, you know, why don't you state the fact that iOS is going to be the dominant player? Well, they are a dominant player. They're number 2 in the world. The question is, will they ever get to number 1? That answer we have yet to see. We have to see how that plays out. My whole thinking is that they might not even be the second in the world. They might end up being third, and that's because Apple, I think, is having a lot of trouble marketing itself in many of the emerging economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China. And again, it's a lack of understanding on behalf of many of these American tech bloggers. And I say American. I have to say that for a second because they're sort of blogging from their, you know, nice office in Northern California or here in New York City. And they're not really looking at the rest of the world or how many people act. And they sort of forget the fact that the way that we buy technology is not the way that many people in the emerging economy will buy technology. So even though I do think Android will probably again, you know, continue to be the dominant player in the mobile market, I still have always been bullish on Windows 8. And disclaimer, I'm not being paid by Microsoft to say this. I've always believed this if you go back to many of my blog postings and a lot of my talks for over the past 6 months. And the reason I say this is because, one, they did a deal with Nokia. I think the Lumia is a great phone. But 2, I'm looking at only emerging markets. I'm not looking at the United States per se. I think iOS and Android will always dominate the US market. I think Windows will always be, you know, the one toward the bottom along with BlackBerry. But I think if you look at the global scale of things, this is where it gets interesting. I think Windows could actually be the number 2 player because one thing is, I think they can price aggressively in certain markets: India, Brazil, China. I think they also can price aggressively amongst certain demographics in Europe. And then, of course, if you look at Africa and the emerging smartphone technology that will happen there, I think they can price aggressively there, and they could really own the marketplace. Again, it all depends on the steps that a company takes in terms of how they want to present themselves in a particular market. But we have to remember that just because a player in business is dominant now doesn't really mean anything anymore. Because, as noted, players in business for most of the 20th century, they could hold that position for a long time. They could be the incumbent. They didn't have to spend a lot of money on innovation or research and development. They could just sort of set themselves on cruise control, and they were set. I think now you're looking at almost a 2-year cycle where you have to constantly be innovating. You have to constantly be finding mysteries or solving mysteries to move ahead of the marketplace. A great example is BlackBerry. They owned the smartphone marketplace. Owned it. Now they can barely make a dent globally in that marketplace because they didn't innovate quick enough. That's not to say that they'll always be at the end of the spectrum. They could come out with very interesting technology. We don't know what their next step is in that area. And they could end up really climbing again. And Apple will not always have a dominant operating system. We don't know what's going to happen there. They might move more into the smartwatch technology and sort of leave the smartphone behind in the next 10 years. Again, we don't know where they're headed with that. The same thing with Microsoft. The Windows 8 phone might be a failure here in the United States, but it could really take off in other emerging parts of the globe. And ultimately, Windows 8 as an operating system could take off based on the fact that they're also rolling out a smartwatch, and the operating system works very well on tablets from what I've been able to actually play around with. So again, the nature of business now is constantly fluctuating, constantly switching. There's always going to be players on top, and they're always going to fall down to the bottom. It's very hard to remain the incumbent because when you're the disruptor, it's very easy to chop away at market share. You can innovate fast. You can take chances. You can take risk. When you're the incumbent, you don't take risk. You run the algorithm. You run the course. You run the spreadsheet. You don't really want to do anything to hurt your market share. And that's why it's possible, usually, to end up on the wrong side of the scale again, so to speak, by not innovating and not disrupting. So again, for feedback, DJGEOFFE on Twitter. I am speaking at the Westchester Digital Summit on May the 14th. Make sure you get your tickets for that. It should be a great event. Actually talking about disruptive innovation for small to medium-sized businesses, how mobile and tablets are your new weapons, so to speak. And my next blog piece for the Social at Ogilvy blog is also talking about mobile as your new office. So curious to see or hear your feedback on that one. At DJGEOFFE on Twitter. Disruptive Innovation FM.
Disruptive innovation.